Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see so many of you here. I know a number of people will be joining uh, as someone who is watching recording rather than being here live, but I'm really encouraged to see so many people. My name's Amanda, and I am the founder and co-director of Neurodiversity Networks, which is a community interest company. Set up with my friend and colleague Janine Perryman Harris, who is the founder of ADHD Wise UK, because we felt there was a need to have a much broader reach in terms of support and advice and education around neurodiversity. I did a talk earlier on in the week about what neurodiversity is, but in very basic terms, it tends to be an umbrella term for difficulties, differences, challenges, diagnoses, whichever way you want to look at them, a cluster of kind of conditions which include things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, and Tourette's. So I have great pleasure in being the host this morning, and my colleague and friend in the business, Sarah, has very kindly agreed to give her time this morning to talk to you about Tourette's syndrome and tics. I know very little, even as a professional, so I am here to learn more. And I hope that all of you, whether you're a parent, professional, or an individual, find it really useful. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah and turn myself on mute.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for the brief introduction, and thank you for inviting me to talk about Tourette's syndrome and tic syndromes in general. I found in the last few weeks in particular, there's been increasing concerns from parents around their children having tics and how that might reflect within the schooling environment. I think it's especially kind of marked in terms of lots of children haven't been at school for different reasons, and so going back to school has different tensions. In a way, I'm quite lucky as I'm doing a lot of work from my home, so that I'm more able to manage having Tourette's syndrome within my home environment than what I am my work environment. So yes, I've been invited to speak about Tourette's syndrome and tic syndrome, and I know that we have parents here, we have professionals, we have children and young people here that want to find out a little bit more. The reason why I was so keen on talking about Tourette's, because I think it's not frequently acknowledged that you can have Tourette's and work and work very hard and be good at what you do. So, but especially I think if you're a woman with Tourette's, I think that has particular kind of assumptions around having Tourette's as well. So I'm really pleased to be able to speak here today, and I'll talk a little bit about my own journey towards a diagnosis of Tourette's as well as some other bits. So about me. You can contact me in various different ways, and lockdown has not done me well. You can see that I haven't dyed my hair for a long time. I haven't put makeup on for this event, but regardless, you can still contact me on the below details. But about me, so I have I've got a master's degree in inclusive education, and I specialise in working with children that might be marginalised for lots of different reasons. That might be because they're excluded from school. That might be because they have health needs that makes it difficult for them to go to school. And that can be anything from cancer, anxiety, depression, Tourette's, brain injuries, and so on. But also children that might be permanently excluded because of their behaviour. That means I've had some great pieces of work where I've been able to go to children's care homes, psychiatric inpatient care units, as well as mainstream primary schools and secondary schools. Also done work for prisons and so on. I tend to do kind of different pieces of work that interest me really, which I really enjoy. But in terms of about me as well, I was diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome rather late, at age of about 27, 28 years old, I would say. And to that end, it's been a bit of a journey in terms of an atypical presentation of Tourette's, but I still hope that my experiences can be illuminating regardless. I often hide and suppress my tics during the day, but I suspect that actually it might be helpful for the young people in this room and other professionals to see what Tourette's looks like and how it can kind of impact on the delivery and speech and so on. So I'm not going to suppress like I would normally, and I think that's appropriate in this context. So please be kind, because I do find it embarrassing too. So I suspect that Dr. Google has already told you a little bit about Tourette's, and I want to go beyond that and talk about my own experiences of Tourette's. And if people want to share their own experiences of Tourette's within the chat box, feel free as well, and what might be challenging or difficult around it. So Dr. Google has probably already told you about some of the symptoms around tics or multiple tic disorders. The symptoms are multiple tics. To get a diagnosis of Tourette's syndrome, you generally need to be presenting with tics for quite a while. I think it's 9 months, but it probably changes as time goes by. It could be a year now, for example. I'm not sure. But you need to have what's called both motor tics and vocal tics. And motor tics are anything in terms of your physical actions, and vocal tics are can be noises, for example, can be grunts, can be copying other people. So sometimes someone might say something and you might repeat it, or you might say something and repeat it under your breath as well. I have key phrases that I tend to use in terms of tics, and they tend to be things like "I eat tigers" or "I love squirrels," but also it can be things like coprolalia, which literally means shit mouth in terms of Latin, and that can be the inappropriate phrases and language that might come out. So that might be the things that feel quite difficult and can feel quite targeted. So, for example, if I'm out in London and it's very busy, I find it very difficult on trains in terms of a sensory perspective, because there's lots of people around me. But also I find that because I'm worried about saying something, then my tics come out more, and they're often more targeted and can come across as being racist and homophobic, or just really quite targeted and nasty, and that's quite difficult. Some aspects of it are easier being a woman because I'm quite small, I'm 5'1", and people fairly quickly see that I have Tourette's or can hear that I've got Tourette's, and they don't see it as being particularly obnoxious or obtuse, because they just assume that I've got Tourette's. But I still find that people might not sit next to me and things like that, which can be quite upsetting, or people stare, and that's quite difficult too. Symptoms generally show between the ages of 2 and 14 years of age, with 6 being the average. I find that some of the adults that I talk to in terms of their children, actually the presentation seems to be more anecdotally at the age of sort of 12, 13. And that might be because they've become more aware of it in terms of their schooling system, friendship dynamics, and being in larger schools as well. So actually my experience is that children often they become even more aware or more concerned about it at a slightly older age. I feel like I'm paid to say that coprolalia, which is what often parents and children are really concerned about, tends to only affect about 10% of the population who are diagnosed with Tourette's, which means that 90% of people with Tourette's don't have coprolalia. One of the things that's really important to recognise is Tourette's waxes and wanes, which means it changes. The tic you might have today might not be the one that you have tomorrow. I find from a personal level, I have kind of what I said, stock phrases that might, like the whistle, for example, or I eat squirrels might come more frequently, but then there might be a certain particular situational phrase that comes out, or there might be a very distressing tic, such as hitting my chest or throwing phones, which is annoying, that will change and come and go as they as soon as they come, they might go in a few days' time. And that can be quite helpful to hold on to as a child and an adult, that actually what you might have today might be gone tomorrow. But you've probably already know lots of this because you've probably already Googled stuff if you're here, because you're interested in it as a concept. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Tourette's and what it meant for me. So for me, it's the multiple tics, and that can be really challenging. So it's the things like the shouting, the phrases, the words, and the repetitions. Also, singing seems to be one of them. things like facial tics as well. So I was meant to go and play with my friend yesterday online, obviously not in real life or in a playground. But I felt that I had quite a strong motor tic in my jaw. And I said, I'm just too tired. And I would like to, do you mind if we don't play on a quiz tonight? And that was absolutely accepted. But things like shrugging and throwing things and hitting people is quite a common feature for my tics as well. And one thing that Tourette's means as well is having what's called a premonitory urge. So if you might have heard of the term premonition, so the knowledge that it might happen before it actually occurs. So I might have a feeling in which I know that I'm going to tic before it occurs. Not all the time. Sometimes I just tic and I don't really notice anymore. But some people describe it as if it's a sneeze and you can kind of feel it somewhere in your body before you tic. But in other circumstances, what you might find is that it just happens and you don't really notice it. For some, they might want to take themselves out of a classroom, for example, or they don't feel safe or comfortable ticking, and so they're able to, and they want to suppress that tic. I don't urge either way. I think the choice is individual and up to you. The only thing I would urge is that it has to be about what you want as an individual with Tourette's, not what someone else wants because it's convenient for them. And the other aspect around Tourette's, which I think is really important to talk about, is I have this kind of concept about actually how other people perceive my Tourette's. So I get really worried that I'm annoying people and that I'm frustrating people by having Tourette's. But also I worry that I have so much pride in what I talk about and what I say and how I engage with people. So I often do international and national speaking that I worry, and I have such control over what I say, and at other times I have such little control over what I say in terms of the vocal tics. And I've had fairly frequently people telling me to stop, and even if they don't verbalize that they want me to stop, you can see from their faces that they want me to stop. And also the other perception is people saying, oh, that isn't a tic, or someone else making a decision about what the tic is. Now, the reality is I don't always know what a tic is, so I'm not sure how anyone else would know. The other aspect as well around Tourette's or multiple tic disorders is that kind of disbelief in yourself. So I had lots of questions around, wait, is this really Tourette's, or am I just putting it on? Am I making it up? And also there was that kind of concern for me about, well, what happens actually if the Tourette's is something else? Like maybe I've got like a really serious degenerative brain disorder, and then that kind of panic about what on earth is going on with me. Tourette's as well, in terms of kind of lived experience, generally means there's lots and lots of overlaps, which is exactly why Amanda's invited me to speak today, because the brain is so complex and there's so much neurodiversity. So you might find that people with Tourette's might also have things such as a diagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, autism, sensory processing needs. The list goes on. And I think it kind of shows the complexity of Tourette's. It's not something very simple or very easy to understand. And I think that's where that disbelief in yourself comes as well. Because if I have a broken leg, I can go to the doctor and go, look, I'm in a lot of pain, go to the hospital, get an x-ray. You can see it. But actually the reality is Tourette's is diagnosed based on symptomology. So I would go and speak to my GP, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, and I would list what the kind of concerns were. And then as you start talking about it, it feels very silly. But because remember what I said about waxing and waning, that things change. So actually for me, during lockdown, it's been quite quiet for me because I've been able to tic whenever I want. And I have the space in which to do that. Whereas actually when I'm at work, I might feel that I have to suppress and so on. So that becomes quite complicated too. So I call this my atypical journey towards diagnosis. And actually the reality is that people might have a very different journey. Now, the A before the word typical means it is not typical. Okay, just so in case people aren't sure what that means. So my not typical journey towards diagnosis. So I've always ticked, but I've not really taken much notice of it because they were very, very low level. So one of my friends, for example, used to call me Squeaker. And I never kind of really understood or just thought it was kind of me being quirky. I didn't really have a kind of appreciation or understanding about any underlying issue. Um, I had tics when I was tired, when I was frustrated. Sometimes when I'm annoyed and grumpy, I might tick more, but also when I'm excited. And I think that's really important to recognize, because I think parents can be particularly worried, and rightly so, about, is my child in distress when they tick? Well, actually, it might be because they're incredibly excited, and that's just the way that they're showing it. And often I'm like that as well. So I'm terrible at airports, for example, because I'm so excited about going on holiday that I'm ticking various obscene things as I'm going through the airport. But part of that isn't because I'm tired or I'm grumpy. It's because I'm just so looking forward to going away. I'm really desperate to go away. My other kind of atypical journey towards diagnosis was mental health issues. Probably, I've tried to remember what the age was. I was on antidepressants from quite a young age, probably from about the age of 14, but I don't really remember. It could have been easily 16 years of age. I don't know. But just to give you an idea that clinical depression was a feature of my kind of teenage years, to the extent that I found medication helpful from the age of 14. I've been on and off medication for several years. So I've had fluoxetine and so on for the depression. And then eventually I got pregnant, and I had what's called antenatal OCD. And that was really restrictive to my everyday life. I can't talk about how restrictive that was. That was so much more restrictive than Tourette's syndrome, actually. So I would find it very difficult to go out for lots of different reasons. I had a lot of internal dialogue about cleanliness for a particular one, but also I was very physically poorly during pregnancy, and I knew everything there was to know on NICE guidelines about gestational diabetes, for example. I would spend long hours into the night, 3-4 o'clock in the morning, researching about this. I was also very poorly in terms of antenatal depression, undiagnosed, not really understood or really realized. I then had my baby, and that kind of increased significant mental health issues. I was diagnosed with OCD at that time. And that's, I was wandering the streets, talking to myself, not cleaning, was very, very unwell. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and had significant treatment for that, postnatal depression. And I had more pronounced tics, really pronounced, really incredibly difficult. I was finding it difficult to sustain normal living and going out. And actually, I stopped going out so much because I was so embarrassed by the tics. And I would be shouting and throwing things across the room and shrugging shoulders. And it was exhausting, let alone having a new baby. It was really physically tiring as well. I went to my GP. I had medication for the postnatal depression. Realistically, I should have been hospitalized at that point. There was concerns that I had psychosis after, which means where you see or experience things that aren't true. So, for example, I didn't believe that my baby was mine, and those sorts of things. So, kind of retrospectively, working with psychiatrists, they've gone, you should have been hospitalized then. So I went to my GP, and I went to my GP again and said, I'm whilst the kind of the postnatal depression and the PTSD I was on medication for, I was still making lots and lots of noises and finding things really, really difficult. As I said, not going out so much, and finding that I would go to work, I would hold it all in, and on the way back from work, I would be trying to sing to music, but I wasn't able to do it because I was constantly being interrupted by tics, vocal tics or motor tics. And that was becoming problematic because I like to sing in the car when no one's listening. It was the way that I kind of unwound. So I had a neurologist referral, and that's where, and I insisted with the GP. I said, I need to go. I knew what Tourette's was. And I'd watched some videos. I Dr. Googled, like you've probably done, and gone, this seems to be kind of hitting this threshold. And it was probably a year or so down the line as well. So I went to a neurologist, I think it was in Queen Square, and they did a couple of tests, not significant. They were in terms of just checking that it was my reflexes and it wasn't other things that might be presenting in a similar way. But they said no, in terms of the kind of the clinical indicators, you have Tourette's. But I didn't believe them. So remember what I said about that idea of disbelief? I was like, no, it can't be Tourette's. I'm just being silly. So I asked for a second opinion, and I went back to St George's Hospital for the Tourette's specialist there. And he said, what do you think it is? And I said, I don't know. And he said, I can tell you it's definitely Tourette's. So from that avenue, because it was having difficulty on my life, I decided to start trialing different medications. With the acute awareness, there is no cure for Tourette's. So any medication that I took may or may not work. I started with a medication called aripiprazole. And aripiprazole is also used for people with psychosis, but at a different level. So I was having a very low level. I started taking aripiprazole, but found that what that meant for me is I had what's called akathisia, which is where you feel like you can't sit still. I've never had anything like it. I've seen children have it when they've had medication, but this idea that I couldn't sit down, I had to be doing something, had to have this energy. That kind of dissipated after a few weeks' time, but it also didn't have a massive effect on my Tourette's in particular. I also had a medication called tetrabenazine, and tetrabenazine, as I remember, is also used for epilepsy, but again at a different dosage. That worked really, really well for my Tourette's, and it worked really well because it put me to sleep within 30 minutes. So I would take tetrabenazine and then I'd be asleep. It was no good for my life. I was working, I was doing things. And I think that was all. I think I was given Paradol as well, but I decided not to take it. I think I was given that medication, but decided not to take it in the end after lots of consideration. So I don't have any medication for my Tourette's unless the medication I take for my depression, for example, has an impact. And that's been quite a difficult decision for me to make. But I've decided that actually, while some of my tics might be physically uncomfortable for me, actually they are more uncomfortable for other people than they are for me, and I don't want to take medication for them. I was also offered I can't remember what it's called. That's it, habit reversal therapy, where you experience that premonitory urge, you acknowledge it, and then you try and change it to something else. But again, I probably already do that within the context anyway. I was put on a waiting list, and I think it's been 6 years, so I presume that waiting list doesn't really exist. And I was also offered quite pioneering treatment in terms of deep brain stimulation. And I know that's made fundamental impact on some people with Tourette's. I decided that I didn't want anything playing with my brain. And I think that's the idea is that it's an individual choice. So my view is that if you do seek further treatment or want to have a further understanding, then just know what the implications are. I don't think anyone has a right to tell anyone else what they do with their bodies, medication or otherwise. After this session, I've been faffing around with a resource pack, because I do have a resource pack, but it's not beautiful enough for me yet, and I want to make sure that what I'm giving you is helpful. But the resource pack goes through the elements and demands of a school day for people with Tourette's, and it's been collated over several years with, I think, about 300 people contributed to what they would find helpful in terms of Tourette's, and I've collated it and themed it then before school, after school, during classroom, transitions in terms of moving on, post-16 education, and unstructured times. And I've done that because I wanted to acknowledge that actually Tourette's isn't just about what's happening in the classroom. There are so many more demands when you go to school. So, for example, I spoke to you quite early on in this session about if I get the train, if it is busy, and the sensory impact of everything around you. But also imagine if you're a child and you're getting the school bus, for example, and there's peers from another school that might not know you have Tourette's. The experience is there, and less kind of grown-ups, adults supporting that. So I've tried to take the journey of the child throughout the school day in order to, and given kind of different ideas and different advice. And what I will do, Amanda, if that's okay, is make sure that you have that available. And I'm going to put it on my website as well with the idea. It's just a free resource that people can use and talk with other people about.
That's absolutely fine.
Cool.
And when we send out the recording, I'll make sure that the admin team have got that to send to people.
Yeah, and I want to make it look pretty though, Amanda, because I'm quite fussy. Like, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that.
Uh, Oh,
So, so that's it from my perspective. I just wanted to give you a kind of a brief overview. One more thing I will say is that there's lots of conversations about that idea of belief. People often suppress their tics for lots of different reasons. Now, they might actively suppress their tics because they're embarrassed or they don't want people to know about them, or it might be a very kind of unconscious thing. But I think that often has a kind of an impact on tiredness as well. So I'm often really, really tired. I love sleeping, absolutely love sleeping. But I think that's also partly because I kind of I suppress my tics often throughout the day, and that takes a kind of mental coordination a lot of the time, especially when I'm working. But also the act of physically ticking can be quite tiring. Like, it's quite exhausting, like shouting and moving a lot, unsurprisingly, really. So that can be a factor as well, is tiredness in terms of suppression. So that needs to be kind of factored in and thought about too. I'm kind of aware I've just kind of spoken at everybody. I don't even know for how long, but I hope that's a kind of helpful overview. And I'm happy to take questions or anyone's thoughts or concerns or advice from a kind of I forgot to say, by the way, guys, I'm a qualified teacher. I've got a master's degree. I'm doing a PhD. I think that's really important for the girls in this who have Tourette's that are here today. Just because you have Tourette's, it doesn't mean you're stupid, and also it doesn't mean you can't do really well with your life as well. I think Amanda would agree that I'm quite feisty on occasions.
yes.
So I want to also reassure people that with a diagnosis of Tourette's, it also doesn't mean that it stops your path to university and doing amazing things as well. I just wanted to say that too.
Thank you, Sarah. That's brilliant. Before I stop the recording, I'm just wondering if it might be helpful if I just first ask a couple of questions.
Sure.
That is to be on the recording for those people who haven't been able to join us, and then I'll stop and we'll kind of open it up to everybody who's here. So so one of the things that I was wondering is when you went to these different neurologists to discuss your symptoms, did anybody ever explain to you at that point, or have you had an explanation since of why this happens? Do we even know? I'm really curious to know, kind of, why this seems to happen for some people and not others. Has anyone?
I think the reality is that we don't know. I'm very aware
Mm.
we've got a children's A&E consultant here, so I'm hoping that I'm right. But no, the reality is we still don't know. We don't really understand Tourette's syndrome.
Yeah.
And there are conversations, for example, about whether or not it's almost like a traumatic response to things, or whether or not it's just part and parcel of neurodiversity. And we know that Tourette's in some form has existed for a fairly long time. So I think, the guy, I can't remember his name now, which is terrible, who wrote the dictionary. So he collated all the words to write a dictionary. He is incredibly likely to have had Tourette's, in that he used to make unusual noises and he used to have unusual movements and so on. So we know that it's existed. Do we know why some people might have it more than others? No. Do we know why boys are more likely to be diagnosed? No. I think there's some information out there, but it's not as clear as it is. It is not definitive. It's like what I said, if you go to a doctor and you've got a broken leg, it's pretty easy to kind of define and know about. But Tourette's syndrome is, because it's the brain, it's just more complex, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it's almost as useful to know that we don't know, because I think sometimes there might be people out there who might make an assumption based on very little, and sort of then say, oh well, yeah, well of course it's because that person is stressed, or it's because that person had a trauma. And actually, if what the evidence is suggesting is that we genuinely don't know that's the case, that is quite useful information to have. And
Yeah.
it's just being able to support what we're seeing in front of us, rather than trying to to come up with an explanation that genuinely we don't know.
And I think like, professional curiosity is, and, if it's your own kid as well, that curiosity is really important. And I think there's one bit I think is helpful to know whether or not, for example, if you know that your child ticks and you know that your child ticks at circumstances, is taking a step back and thinking, well, what are those circumstances? And as I said, for me, excitement is a huge one, absolutely huge one. But oddly, when I teach, I don't ever have an urge to tick, which is great, which is why I always make sure I teach at least once a week, because it's a bit of a kind of relaxing time for me, bizarrely. So there's those elements as well. And I think if the ticks are distressing in themselves rather than distressing others, I think if you can minimize that risk, then that's great. And that's something that I talk about in the resource pack. So, for example, one of my ticks, it's not at the moment, is hitting my chest. So I put a cushion in front of my chest. So it's not so much about stopping the tick, because that can be like, if the need is still there for it to happen, I think. So the hit still continues, but I don't harm myself. I think if there's opportunities to minimize the risk in that context, then that can be really helpful as well. But if it's other things like that you can't minimize the risk, then if you can minimize the circumstances in which that tick occurs, that can be quite helpful. But to reiterate, just because you have that tick today doesn't mean you have it tomorrow, can be quite reassuring, I think.
Yeah, and I just got one other question that I'm quite keen to sort of have recorded before we then kind of open up and can invite people to speak. Is it the case that if a child, for example, in a class is certainly exhibiting tics or perhaps has a diagnosis, that the kind of the stress and anxiety around kind of trying to adults or teachers or staff trying to stop them, is it the case that actually can make it worse?
Yeah, I wouldn't advise
Yeah.
stopping a tic at all. I think, and I've worked with kids with Tourette's as well as having Tourette's, and some of them can be incredibly distressing. I think there's different ways in which, as I said, if a child is hitting their lap, for example, give them a cushion on their lap. I think if a child has coprolalia, so they're saying things that are unkind, I think the education, but the intention isn't to be unkind. I think we have to be clear about that as well. I think the education of others around you, so and so has Tourette's, and what this means for this young person is X, Y, Z. So, for example, if this video is helpful for other people, then from my perspective, then share it, because actually, I think the more information we can give to people, then it's really helpful. But I think trying to demonstrate a stopping of a tic is not helpful. Also, sending a child out for Tourette's is not helpful. And I compare it to, for example, if a child has epilepsy and they have a seizure, then you don't send them out the class, do you? Because it's something that they can't help. You minimize the risks associated with that seizure, but you certainly don't say, well, now you have to leave my class. That's not how it works. The medical conditions in schools, in terms of responsibilities of the school, is, I would be saying, actually there needs to be an individual healthcare plan for that child, which acknowledges some of the difficulties and looks at ways of supporting that child in class. And as I said, I've worked with children with incredible things that they might say or do in terms of Tourette's, but actually with a gentle approach and a professional curiosity and an openness to have conversations. It's not expensive to include a child. It takes time, but also, as I kind of said at the beginning, there's lots of issues around self-esteem and disbelief in yourself. I was really disappointed to read an article that I'm going to refuse to share. It was written by a consultant psychiatrist that was basically saying that if you have Tourette's, then don't talk to other people with Tourette's, because it might make your tics worse, which is probably true to an initial point for a couple of days. So if I hang around with someone with Tourette's, I might pick up their Tourette's for a couple of days. But also there's this issue around community and belonging. But also, okay, I've gained another tic for a couple of days. That's my business. It's not anyone else's to control who I see or do. And I know parents often find that very worrying. Well, what happens if my child picks up a tic that's inappropriate? Well, it will probably disappear in a couple of days, and only 10% of people with Tourette's have coprolalia anyway. So you've got to balance that with this idea about making sure that people with Tourette's are visible, because I think it's really easy. Like when I was really unwell, for lots of different reasons, I was very invisible, and I would stay at home and people wouldn't see my Tourette's, but also it meant that they weren't educated.
Absolutely. You know, and that's why when we had, you know, the conversation last week about doing this morning, I said, there's an awful lot of information out there about lots of things, particularly for, you know, when I'm aware of discussions in parent groups or training that's available for schools and settings. And it's not very often that there is Tourette's on the menu. And I know somebody that I know who is local to me, who really wanted to access a support group, a young teenager, and the nearest one, it was in the next county. And so from my point of view, I'm just, you know, incredibly grateful that you've given us the time today. And I hope that people who are here and people who then get the recording, you know, that you do sort of share it if you can, get in touch with Sarah, and hopefully we can sort of do more and try and kind of, you know, widen that reach, because I do feel that people feel quite isolated.
I think that's a real thing, and I think this has been a whistle-stop tour. I had very little time to prepare.
I didn't give Sarah much time to sort this out. I must
not
say.
much time at all,
Not
which is fine. So I'm very finicky about different things. So I think there's different elements about, and because we've got such a mixed group here in terms of, we've got pediatricians, we have parents, we have children, we have professionals. So people have come from different perspectives. But I think if we start with the idea that actually this is to promote understanding, then you build on the other bit. So if, for example, you know, I would be more than happy to work with yourself, Amanda, and go, let's do a targeted group for parents. Let's do a targeted group for children. And then because actually the education has to happen in the education system, and that means teachers need to have a wider understanding of neurological diversity, because it's, for sure, we work with complex people because people are complex.
They are. Right. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to stop the recording.
Cool.
So then people can put their cameras back on, and I'm sure if anybody wants to ask a question, you can either pop it in the chat or just kind of wave and we'll come to you. So I'm going to stop the recording now. I'll just check that has stopped. Yes.